Hi there and welcome to the latest installment of my life writing series, where today I'll be talking about Reinaldo Arenas' 1992 book, Before Night Falls. But before I come on to that, I just want to clarify why I love life writing so much. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not all life writing that interests me. That is, if you were to hand me a ghost-written autobiography of a member of the British royal family, imagine such a thing. My lack of enthusiasm would be palpable. No, the focus of my interest is a subgenre of life writing, of works produced in the most trying of circumstances, works which, at their best, demonstrate a commitment to the act of writing no other genre can match. And today's book, Before Night Falls, is an outstanding example of just such a work. So, having said that, let's talk about our author, Reinaldo Arenas. And what I'll do here is firstly give a biographical sketch and then walk through the 5 sections of his book, providing commentary on each of them as we go. Arenas was a Cuban novelist, poet and playwright who was openly homosexual and an outspoken critic of Castro's government, and it's his resistance to the Cuban authorities' attempts to limit his ability to express himself artistically, sexually and politically that forms the core of this book. He was born in 1943 in Oriente province and grew up in absolute poverty on his parents' small farm. As a teenager, he ran away to join the rebels led by Fidel Castro in their battle to overthrow the dictatorship of Batista. After the successful revolution, he was taken to Havana, where, due to his rural background, he was sent to train as an agrarian accountant. When not busy with his studies, he was exceedingly promiscuous, enjoying countless opportunistic encounters with random men and establishing a pattern of sexual behaviour that would persist throughout his adult life. In 1963, Arenas' life took a dramatic turn when he entered a storytelling competition at the National Library. He didn't win, but his literary promise was spotted by one of the judges, who arranged for him to be transferred to a job at the National Library. His intellectual and artistic development now proceeded along 2 fronts. Firstly, he now had the necessary time to read what was on the shelves of the library and also to produce his own writing, but he was also introduced to the leading Cuban writers of the day, one of whom, Jose Lezama Lima, became his mentor and lifelong friend. With help from Lima, Arenas completed his debut novel, The Singing Well, which won a state prize upon its publication. However, the authorities soon had a change of heart and banned further printing and distribution of this work. Undaunted, Arenas wrote a second novel, which also won a state prize, but which was refused publication altogether. Realizing the situation he was in, Arenas resorted to desperate means and instead began smuggling his manuscripts out of Cuba to Spain and France and having his work published abroad. The Cuban authorities were naturally infuriated by Arenas' ability to evade their regime of censorship, and thus began a game of cat and mouse between Arenas and state security, where, knowing that he must not be caught in possession of any writings because they would be confiscated, as soon as he produced a manuscript, he would deposit it with friends or stash it in an elaborate hiding place, only retrieving it if there was a risk of discovery or the opportunity arose to smuggle it out of the country. In a game such as this, both sides score victories, both sides suffer defeats, and while Arenas was able to smuggle many of his manuscripts out of the country, in the case of one novel, Farewell to the Sea, he had to rewrite it 3 times before it was successfully exported. By the end of the 1960s, Arenas was thoroughly disillusioned, as were many of his fellow Cubans. The economy lay in ruins, and the government's response was to step up repression and also to mobilize tens of thousands of men, Arenas among them, and dispatch them to concentration camps in the countryside, where, in slave-like conditions, they would spend the summer months under the burning sun harvesting sugarcane. For Arenas, worse was to come, and in 1972 he was falsely accused of violating 2 minors and convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison, the majority of which he served at the El Morro Castle, a medieval fortress just outside Havana, When he was eventually freed, he began living a hand-to-mouth existence, still persecuted by the authorities and dreaming of freedom, which seemed at that point impossible. However, in 1980, during the confusion of the Mariel boat lift, he managed to board a boat and finally escape the island, touching down in America, where he lived for the remainder of his life, chiefly in New York, where in the mid-80s he was diagnosed HIV positive and he died of AIDS in 1990. Quite a life, I'm sure you'll agree, and if you're thinking it would make a great movie, it already has, because in 2000, Before Night Falls was released, directed by Julian Schnabel and starring Javier Bardem in what was his breakthrough role. Okay, so in part 2 of this video, I'll consider Before Night Falls as a literary text, and I'm going to focus on two aspects. Firstly, its form, and secondly, the way it blends and hops between genres, because along with Arenas' absolute commitment to his art, I feel that these features are key to what makes reading this book such a rewarding experience. The first section, which focuses on Arenas' childhood, establishes the form the book will follow. You have brief sections of text, episodic in nature, the contents of which are typically magical, erotic, or violent, and then longer sections of text, never running to more than 20 pages or so. And it's in here that the narrative is pushed forward and the contents tend to be more social, historical, and cultural. In fact, I've already reviewed a novel for the channel which has a very similar form to Before Night Falls, and that is The Lover by Marguerite Duras. The parallels are striking. Each writer is surveying their childhood as they approach the end of their lives. Each writes frankly about their precocious sexuality, and each produces writing that is erotic and violent by turn. While both Duras and Arenas counterpose erotic scenes with depictions of violence, Duras' treatment is far more elusive, whereas Arenas tends to be extremely graphic. Their aesthetic is also different. Duras shows how the forbidden can be beautiful, whereas Arenas tends to want to show that the ugly can be beautiful. And in this sense, he is far closer to a writer like Genet. The next section, which focuses on Arenas' life in Havana during the 60s, does not so much belong to a genre as take place in the literary mode of the carnivalesque. Arenas depicts what amounts to a national orgy, a vast sexual free-for-all, where the only non-participant is Castro, the impotent killjoy, who will ultimately bring this frenzy to a close. There are scenes here that could have come straight from Rabelais, or, if I chose a more recent cultural phenomenon, the English carry-on movies, with perhaps this one being the most appropriately titled. Next comes the darkest section of the book, which focuses on Arenas' period of incarceration. The action switches here between the authentic Gothic gloom of the Morro prison, a medieval fortress, and the State Security HQ, site of interrogation and torture. And the bridge between these two worlds is the sinister Victor, a state agent seemingly able to materialize at will. While the scenes at State Security HQ are, as one might expect, Kafkaesque in nature, what is more striking is how Arenas largely rejects the Gothic in his depiction of life at Morro Castle, nor does he sink into the kind of solipsistic, masturbatory fantasies one finds in Jean Genet's Our Lady of the Flowers. Instead, these scenes of prison life are frequently journalistic in nature, as Arenas documents the inhumanity of the conditions and the ill treatment suffered by himself and other prisoners. And this approach is reinforced by the fact that Arenas forgoes all sexual relations during this period, providing the following justification for what amounts to a political stance. I refuse to make love with any prisoner, even though some, in spite of hunger and mistreatment, were quite desirable. There was no beauty in the act. It would have been a degradation. It was also very dangerous. Those criminals, after mounting a prisoner, felt they owned him and his few possessions. In jail, sexual intercourse became something sordid, an act of submission and subjugation, of blackmail and violence. even of murder in many instances. The beauty of a sexual relationship lies in the spontaneity of the conquest and in its secrecy. In jail, everything is obvious and miserable. Jail itself makes a prisoner feel like an animal, and any form of sex is humiliating. The next section, which focuses on Arenas' life after his release from prison, is, I must confess, my favourite. The label I would apply to this genre is the paranoid picaresque, as Arenas has all kinds of crazy adventures as he struggles not only to survive, but to avoid the attentions of state security. One of the most amusing scenes comes when Arenas and his friends, who are living in terrible conditions in a state of abject poverty, enjoy a stunning stroke of good fortune. The heat was oppressive, and Blanca complained that her room did not even have a window. We immediately started to open a hole in the wall to make a window with what had once been a machete. The wall was over 3 feet thick, and when we got to the other side we realized that it did not lead to the street, but to a huge convent, the convent of Santa Clara, which had been abandoned by the nuns after Castro came to power. Practically intact, the convent was full of furniture, trunks, stained glass windows, and all sorts of objects. With a discipline worthy of ants, we started to dismantle the convent and sell everything we found inside. Suddenly, out of Blanca's little room, with scarcely enough space for a few chairs, 20 or 30 rocking chairs would emerge, or 4 or 5 chests, which we would immediately sell all over Havana. On one occasion, we filled a whole truck. One day, the president of the CDR in her block knocked on Blanca's door and said she could not understand how Blanca could have so many things in her small room. The opening to the convent was covered with one of Blanca's paintings. There was only one thing to do, to bribe the president of the CDR. She was told to take whatever she pleased. The woman took all she could and did not inform on us. I built a cedar loft in my room, installed a toilet and a marble kitchen, and completed my small living room with 18th century furniture. The final section lapses into bitterness as Arenas' health rapidly declines. He feels himself doubly exiled from both his homeland and the Cuban community in the US, and he lashes out in all directions, at American society, at progressives who lend support to Castro's regime, and at celebrated literary figures who have formed friendships with Fidel, first among whom is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It's a sad end to what has been a beautiful book and indeed a beautiful life. So there you have it, a magnificent piece of life writing that's free for you to check out on archive.org, and all that remains is for me to bid you farewell. So be safe, be strong, and I shall see you anon. Nanu nanu.